Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ketogenic Fasting Project. Publishing this a little out of order because I wanted to really take more time with this particular video. The book itself is not ketogenic related, as it were. It is strictly sort of a book on how to look at diet studies in particular. The title there, Death by Food Pyramid, it obviously raises some pretty strong inclinations towards diet. The food pyramid itself is only one of the subjects the book covers, but it does it good. It does it justice. It does a lot of the studies justice just by helping to kind of clear up why we get so much confusing information about studies. And of course, few people ever really read the studies. Now, Denise Minger came on my radar because I was reading the China study, and every time I mentioned it, everybody's like, "Oh, you got to see Denise Minger's comments on the China study." And I'll just point out that the China study, the book, isn't necessarily the China study, the study. So the book that she's critiquing and or became famous for critiquing really is about one person's interpretation, as it were, the of the study. So one of the main researchers in the study wrote a book about it, and she took it to task, like she did a lot of the studies and a lot of how the information is represented. I could probably say now that this is probably the first book I would recommend people read if they're gonna start reading nutrition books. And naturally, from my perspective, if you're gonna start reading about carnivore diet, ketogenic diet, or fasting, or any combination thereof, even if you're gonna be a vegan or a vegetarian or whatever sort of dietary lifestyle has piqued your interest, you might want to start with this book. This book isn't really beholden to any particular dietary way of life. So, but what it does is it helps us understand why we have the perceptions we do and how a lot of things like the food pyramid go awry. The she takes some of the she focuses on fewer studies, I'd say, than like Gary Taubes does, but she kind of gives you more background on the individual studies and the personalities involved. Ansel Keys is frequently vilified in the low carb, ketogenic, and probably the carnivore community. Um, because of how some of his quotes are bantered about, and I'm not saying it's not without good reason, but she explains a little more. She peeks behind the curtain a little more, and you find out that Ansel Keys actually did realize at some point that saturated fat wasn't clearly demonstrated as the culprit. So. The content of the book in general is quite a bit more varied than you'd expect. She herself, the author, Denise Minger, started out as a vegetarian, raw vegan, and had some problems, and that kind of spurred her interest in doing this. So she has an interesting story to tell. She's really good at picking apart the data and giving you some tools to better analyze it. She talks a lot about the development of the food pyramid that was released in the early 1990s. And the story she tells about how they arrived with the pyramid and the advice they did kind of reminds me of that book, A Confederacy of Dunces, because it's not that there's one factor involved. There's not one direction to really point the finger in, but in the end, you're not really all that surprised that it happened the way it did, And a lot of people were very disappointed in it. It was kind of death by pyramid. The food pyramid itself, kind of died by committee in a way. So there was a lot of forces at work. So, and the USDA didn't even really want the responsibility of giving the dietary advice. So you could kind of see how it would all sort of fall into the wrong place. So she kind of explores both the industry, the government, and the perspective of where people are coming from. If you look back and you find out that, the people who were on a ration diet during World War II had a sudden drop in heart attacks or heart disease, you could see why people would be interested in researching that, and that's a good place for interest to be spurred, right? Especially since heart disease is sort of one of those diseases, along with cancer, that seem to gradually get worse from about 1900 on, and by the time you get to World War II in the 40s, it's definitely on everybody's radar. So it's getting a lot of attention, and so they looked at some of the best examples they had in current times as to a population that actually suddenly had a lower incidence of heart disease. So a lot of the research began from an honest place, and the players are well intentioned, but it took a long time to really start sussing out what the studies were actually saying. And when you put a study together and you have a hypothesis and you don't get the information you would expect out of it, you're not getting a yes or a no. Typically, you're getting peripheral information that's pointing you in a different direction. It's tough. It's tough to keep everybody on the rails at that point, right? She goes through a lot of the characters that are involved in what happened in the U.S., during the Nixon administration, with McGovern and Rusty Butts and the Soviet grain crisis and the consequent Soviet grain theft, or whatever you want to call it. So that's all very interesting. She talks about Nathan Pritikin and Dr. Lester Morrison, and of course a wartime European diet of rationed. And I look at that, the rationing, and I think, well, maybe these people are just essentially required to fast because their caloric intake was restricted by war. So maybe it really had less to do with what they were actually eating and the fact that they were just eating less. I think that's entirely possible, and of course that's not something that was really addressed by the studies that followed. They thought they were going to find a magic bullet when it came to, oh, we just stop eating this food or that food and we won't have heart disease anymore. And that, of course, isn't what they really found, not in any meaningful way. So, she makes a point that a statistical correlation does not prove causation. And when you look at a lot of studies, and this is one of the big problems of the China study, is that they're looking for something based on a hypothesis, but they don't. They add and remove one substance from a diet and go, aha, this is the culprit, but they really don't control for all the other substances. So that's a big problem. That, and it's just hard to do big studies. When she starts to talk about the numbers of the people involved and the situations and everything, you realize how just incredibly difficult it is to study populations of any size. So the USDA, of course, reluctantly takes on the role of coupled with the human health services. Is that human? I think that's right. But anyways, they're reluctant to do so, and there's obvious conflicts from the beginning, especially when it came to calculating the food pyramid. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is supposed to represent American agriculture. They're not supposed to be advising people on what to eat, and they never wanted to. It's Health and Human Services. That's HHS. I'm not even sure what I said now, but they jointly started publishing data in around 1980. So the cost of the food stamp program was also a factor, because you're issuing food stamps and people are supposed to be able to eat a reasonable diet, a sustaining diet from those food stamps, but then they have a limited budget on how much they can spend on food stamps. So one of the ways to keep the cost of the food stamp program down was to add in more grains, which of course is grains themselves are strongly contested as far as their how healthy they are to actually eat now. The book really teaches you how to be skeptical about studies and how people represent them. She goes into detail about how to understand some of the more scientific language. She gives you a good look at some studies and the problems they had. She, addresses the shady politics and the shady science. I see this all the time. People are always putting science on a pedestal. And I understand everybody's romance with the scientific method, but that's often not how science is actually practiced. It doesn't matter if you have an argument with an atheist or a vegan or a carnivore or whatever. Everybody thinks science is incorruptible and it's up on this pedestal, and it's nothing of the sort. Science is constantly corrupted by people. And that's one of the things you have to look at. You can't just put this faith in this concept of science, because it just doesn't really exist. So she gives you a lot of reasonable takeaways from looking at the studies, though. So in spite of the fact that the studies are flawed and people's representations of the studies are flawed, she gives you a good idea what to look at, so that you do find some value in them. Oh boy, duplicate slide. Sorry about that. Some of the noteworthy studies that she covers. This is not a comprehensive list of the studies she discusses, but she explains some of the surprises from the Framingham study, which is probably one of the most significant. It's ongoing. It's multi-generational. She talks about the Finnish mental hospital study and the Oslo study and the Veterans Hospital study, all of which come up frequently in books. So I recommend looking at it. There's all kinds of stuff that was not controlled for, from medication to smoking. And, you hear the point made, I believe she made it more than once, that smoking is one of the highest risks for heart disease. So it's one of the highest risk factors. But it does not raise serum cholesterol. It does not itself increase LDL. But what it does is as far as I know, I don't think she says this, but it actually helps damage the walls of the arteries, particularly the coronary arteries and the carotid arteries, and those damaged arteries then need to be repaired, and they're repaired with cholesterol and LDL particles. So right there, you can see that there's a little bit of hole in the logic to blaming saturated fat or a high cholesterol diet, and that's one of the problems, that you can't just put somebody on a high cholesterol diet and watch their cholesterol go up, because such a small percentage of our dietary cholesterol actually winds up in our bloodstream. Our cholesterol is tightly controlled by our liver. So anyways, the book isn't really that much. It doesn't really discuss the China study a lot, like you'd expect, because that's really how Denise Manger wound up on everybody's radar, was because she kind of critiqued the China study. But this book does mention all that, but it's not necessarily a focal point of the book. It certainly takes a backseat to the food pyramid. See comments on people's tribal mentality. I mean, you get online and you start talking to people, and it's almost like a battle between people who eat meat and don't eat meat, or carnivores and the rest is low carb and versus zero carb or whatever, and everybody's throwing quotes from studies around and stuff. And that's something I like to avoid myself. The whole tribal mentality is, I'm a vegan or I'm a carnivore, or I believe that the ketogenic diet is a very powerful tool that can help a lot of people, especially people that have health problems. But I know that there's more to the story, and I know that some people have reverse heart disease on plant-based diets. But that doesn't mean every plant-based diet is good for you either. It certainly doesn't mean every plant's good for you to eat. So that's why I like to keep an open mind, not plant myself in a tribe of any particular type. I take in the information and then I experiment on myself and see what I can do. So see what kind of positive changes, or if I happen to note a negative change. Because I don't think everybody's going to have the same experience, just like we don't all have the same diseases or the same level of health. We don't all have the same diet behind us, and we don't have the same genes, and we don't live in a world where we have the same activities. So, but keep in mind, this book is only partly about the food pyramid itself, but it is a great example of government, industry, studies, people's fears, people's misunderstandings all coming together into a culmination of something that's rather iconic, even though it's not even promoted anymore. But most of us remember it, and even younger people have probably seen it. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and I ask please subscribe to my YouTube channel. The goal these days is to get to 1,000 members, and I probably have less than 20 so far. But I've only been at this a month so far. But I'd like to remind everybody to please stay inspired, stay curious, and I hope this helps somebody out there.